Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. Members, I presented a few amendments yesterday to make this bill just a little less worse. An amendment to create a space for sports carve-out, not because I have a deep love for sports or because the sports lobby made big donations to me, but due to the fact that people are in prison and jail right now because a prosecutor enforced an overbroad criminal statute in a way that would have been considered a wild hypothetical to every legislator who voted to approve it. Just look on the war on drugs for a clear example of policy that Democrats and Republicans have supported in the past that did not end drug usage, but has led to mass incarceration of mostly Black, brown, and poor people. And I hope that the intention of those who supported those hard-on crime bills was not to incarcerate these people, but in fact, maybe it was. My second amendment would have provided a protection to acts of civil disobedience. Like I said yesterday, civil disobedience is as American as apple pie. I don't know about y'all, but when I was first learning about the disability rights movement, the civil rights movement, the LGBTQ rights movement, the environmental movement, and the immigrant rights movement, that I was inspired as a young child. Inspired by the American spirit for equality, freedom, justice for all. Members of those communities have been involved in boycotts, blocking traffic, protests, marches, and sit-ins for generations. And Representative Camilla Brown and so many others mentioned the historical aspects of civil disobedience in American history. I have been parts of acts of civil disobedience, and I attended several Black Lives Matter protests in my district, peaceful protesting that has helped to incur change at a local level, and we hope at a state level. I have helped to organize protests as a college student at the University of Central Florida, and in fact, my first rally was in 2007 at a school board meeting that I attended with teachers and students. When I was in college, it was the 2009 protest for a democratic Iran, protests that were launched because of an undemocratically elected president in Iran that led me to become a human rights advocate globally and here, and to have the word freedom in Farsi tattooed on the back of my neck. It's pronounced Azadi. And I think about that every single day, the fact that in this country, I have access to protest and to share my perspectives compared to my family today in Iran. And as Representative Carlos Smith spoke to after the Pulse nightclub massacre, I was one of the organizers of that act of civil disobedience at Senator Rubio's office, who did nothing to address our concerns of mass shootings and LGBTQ plus equality. And we gathered at his office, and 10 people were arrested that day because they were trespassing, and they accepted arrest. And it was a peaceful protest, and law enforcement followed the law and held those who protested to the point of being asked to removed, and they consented to that arrest. There are rights that each one of us here enjoy because of acts of past civil disobedience. And though I do appreciate the addition of peaceful protesting into the bill today, nowhere is that defined. And my intention of adding the word civil disobedience is purely just to ensure that there isn't a misconstruction that civil disobedience is violent when it is not. But of course, that amendment failed. My third amendment, folks never had a chance to hear because it was ruled as not germane, which I respect the rules chair's decision to do that. But candidly, I think it was an amendment that folks really would have liked because it added new language around insurrectionists. Because I thought this bill was supposed to be about preventing the next insurrection. And in fact, when this bill was first rolled out in September, 2 months before an election, we all knew that that was never the intent, but there were efforts to rewrite history, bring this bill back on January 6th, saying that we want to prevent the next insurrection, yet this bill doesn't have the word insurrection in it once. So I was doing y'all a favor in trying to add that to ensure if any elected official participates in an insurrection, they should be held accountable. But unfortunately, it wasn't germane, which is super ironic, because I thought this bill was supposed to be about insurrections. I can only assume what this bill is really about is not insurrections or maintaining order, but in fact, everything to do with silencing those who challenge the system. A system that is grounded on status quo elements that have kept people down until they fought back. A status quo that unfortunately arrests more black and brown people today than it supports them. A status quo where the middle class is becoming erased as the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And what's really sad about this bill for me is that it exploits tensions versus actually addressing tensions. As elected officials, our responsibility should be to create calm, not to create chaos. Why don't we call out white supremacy for what it is? And why don't we pass policies to eliminate white supremacy? Why don't we listen to the concerns of those who are experiencing systematic racism versus completely ignore it and toss it aside? Members, this bill will disproportionately hurt communities of color who are trying to exercise our constitutional rights. It gives bad actors in law enforcement and the criminal justice system additional weapons to harm, incarcerate, and kill black and brown people as a direct assault against the foundation. And this is a direct assault against the foundation of our democracy. And yes, there has been comments of where law enforcement stand on this. I think it's important to be clear that many law enforcement leaders, both active and retired, have expressed concern and even opposition to this bill, because there are law enforcement officers who want to build trust with their communities, and it's hella hard to do that when we pass bills like this. And finally, these changes to our criminal legal system are unnecessary. As Representative Ben Diamond spoke in his remarks, those who vandalize, those who are violent, they are arrested, and rightly so. Law enforcement already has tools in place to punish wrongdoers, and we don't need to make these broad changes. And finally, I have to stress that there's a monument section in this bill that we haven't really talked about. And again, if your intention is to address actions happening around the country, I'm curious why those protections don't include state buildings like this and instead focus on preserving Confederate monuments, which I can only assume is another political aspect of this bill, one designed to go after a voting base versus focus on everyday people. Members, this bill doesn't solve any problems. This bill is the problem. And I encourage all of you to vote no on House Bill 1.
Representative Alex.